Elena Cho was 3 hours into a night shift that should have been silent, and which was the problem. The Atacama Deep Listening Array did not go quiet. In 4 years of monitoring the galactic background for anything that looked like a signal instead of noise, Elena had learned its voice the way a mother learns a child's breathing. There was always something. A pulsar ticking over like a metronome, the low static hiss of the cosmic microwave background, the occasional satellite chirp bouncing off the dish before the filters caught it. The array hummed. Tonight it did not hum. Tonight, at 2:14 a.m. local time, every channel on her board dropped to a flat, dead baseline within the same 11 seconds, and stayed there. She sat up straight and did what every good technician does before believing something impossible. She assumed she had broken it. "Come on," she muttered, running the diagnostic. Power was fine. Cooling was fine. The receivers reported nominal status across all 41 bands. According to the machine, everything was working exactly as designed. According to the sky, there was nothing left to hear. Elena pulled up the reference feed from the very large array in New Mexico half a world away, and then the one from the square-kilometer array outside Perth. Both were down the same 11 seconds. Not offline, recording faithfully a universe that had simply stopped talking. She picked up the phone to call her supervisor and realized her hand was shaking, which annoyed her, because nothing had actually happened yet. Nothing she could point to, just an absence, spreading outward from every antenna on the planet like a held breath. It would be another 6 hours before anyone realized the silence wasn't local. And another 4 days before the first ship left Earth to go looking for out what exactly had gone quiet and why nobody had thought to warn them first. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By the time the sun came up over the Atacama Plateau, 11 observatories on 4 continents had confirmed the same thing, and the story had climbed out of astronomy forums and into the kind of government meeting where nobody wants to be the one who speaks first. Director Marcus Reyes ran the Deep Space Coordination Office out of a converted aircraft hangar in Nevada, a job that had, for the 18 years he'd held it, mostly involved cataloging radio noise and fighting for a budget line item nobody in Congress cared about. He had built his career on the assumption that the galaxy was busy elsewhere and simply hadn't noticed Earth yet. That assumption had just failed a stress test. "Walk me through it again," he said, standing in front of a wall of monitors that all showed the same flat lines. Every known extragalactic and galactic radio source. Gone. Not faded. Gone. Not gone, Elena corrected, because she'd had 4 days now to think about the word and had decided it was wrong. Silent. There's a difference. A star doesn't stop existing because it stops making noise. Something either turned every transmitter in the galaxy off at once, or they're all dead, said the man next to her. A signals analyst named Priyansh who had clearly not slept. Every civilization that was ever broadcasting. Simultaneously. Overnight. Reyes let that sit in the room for a moment, because saying it out loud was the only way to test whether it sounded as insane as it should. It did, and nobody laughed. "We've had exactly one signal source we could reliably track for the last 30 years, Reyes said. The repeating structure out past the orbit of Neptune. The one the last administration classified and nobody's touched since because we couldn't get a probe out that far fast enough to matter. KX-19, Priyansh said. Still there. Still repeating. It's the only thing in the sky that didn't go quiet." Elena looked up. "Then it's not natural. It's not a star, it's not a pulsar. Whatever that object is, it kept broadcasting through an event that silenced everything else. That makes it either the cause or the last survivor." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, doing the math on what it would cost, politically and financially, to find out which. He had spent 2 decades being told the galaxy was too far away to matter. He was starting to suspect it had just gotten a great deal closer. "Get me a ship," he said. "I don't care what state it's in. If it can carry 3 people and survive a jump, I want it fueled by Friday." The meeting broke up within the hour, but the argument that had started in that room did not stay in it. By noon, a version of the silence had leaked to a science reporter who had a friend at the Very Large Array, and by evening it was the lead story on every network Reyes had spent his career trying to avoid. He watched the coverage from his office with the sound off, jaw tight, as anchors who had never once mentioned his agency by name now filled hour-long segments with graphics of dead stars and speculation about invasion fleets that did not exist yet, as far as anyone actually knew. What the coverage got right, without meaning to, was the fear underneath it. For 100 years humanity had told itself a comfortable story. The universe was vast, distances were enormous, and whatever else might be out there almost certainly hadn't noticed a small, blue, unremarkable planet on the edge of an ordinary spiral arm. That story had never really been tested. It had simply been convenient, the kind of belief people hold not because the evidence supports it but because the alternative is difficult to sit with at 3 in the morning. The silence tested it in 11 seconds, and it did not survive the test. Reyes fielded calls that night from 4 different heads of government, none of whom asked the question he expected, "Is this real?" and all of whom asked some version of the question that actually mattered, "What do we do now?" He did not have a good answer yet. He had a hangar, a half-built ship, and 3 people willing to fly it, and for the first time in 18 years of preparing for a contact scenario that never came, that felt like far too little. The ship's name was Companion, which someone in procurement had chosen years earlier for a mission that never launched, and nobody had bothered to rename it since budgets rarely allow for sentiment. It had been built for a slower age. A proof-of-concept faster-than-light drive tested exactly 4 times in the outer solar system and never on a real voyage, sitting half-finished in a hangar because funding kept drying up before anyone worked up the nerve to actually use it. Now it had 6 weeks to become spaceworthy, a fraction of the safety margin its engineers had wanted, and a crew of 3 who had all, in their own way, spent their careers waiting for a reason like this one. Captain Diane Okafor had flown cargo runs to the lunar mining stations for a decade and had a reputation for bringing ships home in pieces held together mostly by stubbornness. Dr. Samuel Voss, the mission's xenolinguist, had built a career analyzing a signal that never resolved into language, on the theory that eventually it would. Elena Cho, promoted from a listening post to the crew roster on the strength of being the only person who hadn't panicked when the sky went silent, came along because Reyes had decided, correctly, that whoever found the silence first should be there when someone explained it. "You understand this thing has never gone farther than the orbit of Mars," Okafor said, standing at the base of the ship 2 days before launch, looking up at a hull that still had exposed paneling on one side. "And it's never carried a crew." "I understand," Elena said, "and that, if the drive fails at speed, there's a real chance we don't come home in any recognizable sense." "I understand that too." Okafor studied her for a moment, the way a captain sizes up someone she's about to be responsible for keeping alive. "Good. Means you'll listen when I tell you not to touch things." They launched on a gray Tuesday morning with almost no fanfare, because Reyes had decided, over the objections of several people who wanted a press conference, that the last thing a frightened public needed was to watch a barely tested ship leave for parts unknown. Companion cleared the atmosphere, cleared the moon, and 6 hours later, at a distance safely beyond Earth's gravity well, its drive lit for the first time with a human crew aboard. There was no sensation of speed. There was a lurch, a half-second of nausea that Voss later described as like missing a stair that wasn't there. And then the stars outside the viewport rearranged themselves into an unfamiliar pattern. They were no longer in the solar system. They were somewhere the signal KX-19 had been pointing, and for the first time in recorded history, 3 human beings were farther from home than any radio wave had ever reliably carried them. Okafor ran a full systems check before anyone spoke again because that was the kind of captain she was, and because the silence in the cabin needed something practical to fill it. The drive had held. Hull integrity was nominal. Life support hadn't so much as flickered. On paper, the impossible part of the mission was already finished. A ship built in a hangar on a shoestring budget had crossed a distance no human vessel had ever survived crossing, and nothing had broken. "For the record," she said, mostly to herself, "I did not think that was going to work." "For the record," Voss said, still staring out the viewport at a starfield none of them recognized. "Neither did I." Elena said nothing. She was watching her console, where the archived recording of KX-19's pulse sat beside the live signal now arriving in real time, and for the first time in 4 years the 2 waveforms were not an abstraction on a screen in a desert half a world from anything that mattered. They were close enough to touch. She found she had been holding her breath since the jump ended, and made herself let it out slowly, the way she used to tell herself to breathe during her very first overnight shift at the array. Back when the worst thing she expected to hear was nothing at all. *****. The structure came into view 11 hours later, and none of them spoke for almost a full minute. It was not a ship. Ships have proportions that make sense to the beings that build them: doors, engines, places for crew to stand. This was a ring, vast enough that companion sensors initially misread it as a planet with unusual gravitational signature, 40 kilometers in diameter, its surface a lattice of dark material that drank the light of the nearby star rather than reflecting it. Along its inner edge, faint and rhythmic, ran the same pulse Elena had spent 4 years listening to from a desert on Earth, KX-19, still broadcasting, now close enough to feel like a heartbeat instead of a whisper. "That's not a signal source," Voss said quietly. "That's an antenna, the size of a small moon." "An antenna for what?" Okafor asked. Nobody answered, because the ring wasn't alone. As companion sensors resolved the wider volume of space around the structure, more shapes emerged from the dark. Dozens, then hundreds, drifting at odd angles with no thrust, no lights, no signs of active systems. Ships, hundreds of ships, of dozens of unfamiliar designs, motionless, arranged around the ring like the ring had been the last thing they were all looking at when whatever happened. "Debris field?" Elena asked, though she already knew that wasn't right. "Debris doesn't hold formation." "They didn't collide," Okafor said, reading her instruments. "No impact damage on the ones in range. No hull breaches. Whatever stopped them didn't break them. It just stopped them." Voss had gone very still, staring at the readouts. "Life signs." Okafor ran the scan twice before she answered, because the first result seemed like an instrument error. "None," she said. "Not one. Across every ship in range, and there are a lot of ships in range. No heat signatures beyond ambient. No power beyond what looks like idle backup systems still cycling on their own. Whoever was flying these is gone. And it happened fast enough that nobody had time to evacuate, fight back, or even change course. They sat with that for a while. 3 humans, in a ship that had never been meant to leave the solar system, drifting into the middle of what looked less like a battlefield and more like a photograph taken at the exact instant 1,000 lives had simply ended, everywhere at once. "We should go home and report this," Voss said, not sounding like he believed it. "We came a long way to turn around because it's frightening," Okafor said. "Elena, you've heard this thing broadcasting for years. Does it still sound like it did back home?" Elena checked her console, comparing the live signal against the archived recordings she'd brought from the Atacama array. The pattern was identical, the same rhythm, the same structure, the same maddening repetition that had never once resolved into anything anyone could call language. "Same signal," she said, "except it's not decaying, and it's not degrading with age the way you'd expect from an old, unmaintained transmitter. It's clean, almost too clean, like something is still tending it." "Then something's still alive out here," Okafor said. "Or something wants us to think it is." The decision to get closer was not made lightly, and it was not made quickly. Okafor spent the better part of an hour running trajectory models that kept Companion outside what she judged, from nothing more than instinct and a career of respecting things she didn't understand, to be a reasonable safety margin from the ring itself. They would approach the drifting fleet instead, staying well clear of the structure at its center, on the theory that whatever had happened to those ships had already happened, and a field of the dead was safer in the short term than an active weapon of unknown range. It was a reasonable theory. It also meant flying, slowly and deliberately, past hull after hull of vessels that had clearly once carried living crews, through a graveyard large enough that Companion sensors gave up trying to produce an exact count and settled for an estimate that kept climbing the longer they looked. Some of the ships were small, barely larger than Companion itself. Others were vast, kilometers long, marked with designs that suggested purposes none of them could guess at. Habitat rings, cargo bays large enough to move small moons, weapons arrays that had never fired a shot at whatever ended them. Voss cataloged as many hull markings as his equipment could resolve, working in a kind of grim, methodical silence that Elena recognized from her own years of logging noise that never turned into signal. It was the discipline of someone documenting a thing precisely because the alternative, sitting with what it meant, was harder to manage in the moment than the work itself. "There have to be dozens of species represented here," he said eventually, more to fill the silence than because either of the others needed telling. "Maybe more." Different alphabets, different hull geometries, different everything. This isn't one civilization's graveyard. It's a crossroads. Or a trap that's been baited for longer than any of them knew, Okafor said. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They found the first survivor 11 hours later, and it changed the shape of everything they thought they understood. Voss had insisted on boarding one of the drifting ships, a mid-sized vessel with hull markings that resembled no alphabet Earth's linguists had ever catalogued, on the theory that whatever killed its crew might have left something behind that explained itself. Okafor argued against it for exactly as long as protocol required and then suited up anyway, because there was no version of this mission that ended with them not looking. The ship's interior was intact and undisturbed, as though its crew had simply vanished mid-motion. A meal sat cooling, if it had ever been warm. On a surface Voss guessed was a table. A door stood half open where someone had apparently been walking through it. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been fought over. It was less like a crime scene and more like a photograph, a single frozen instant, except the photograph had mass and the crew that should have been in it simply wasn't. They found the survivor in what looked like a medical bay, curled in the corner of a chamber lined with equipment none of them recognized. It was small, roughly the size of a large dog, with a segmented exoskeleton the color of old rust and 6 limbs folded tight against its body. It did not move when Voss's suit light passed over it, and for a moment he assumed it was another body. Then one compound eye opened, slowly, and fixed on him. "It's alive," he said. So quietly Okafor almost missed it over the calm Diane. "It's alive." What followed was 3 days of the most careful communication attempt any of them had ever conducted, made harder by the fact that Voss's entire professional training had prepared him to decode a signal, not converse with a frightened, injured creature that flinched at sudden movement and refused to eat anything they offered until Elena thought to simply leave food nearby and walk away. The first day was almost entirely failure. Voss tried gestures that meant nothing to a creature with 6 limbs and no face built for expression as humans understood it. He tried recorded tones, pulled from the ship's small library of Earth music and speech, hoping something might register as recognizably communicative rather than threatening. Mostly, the creature simply retreated further into its corner, and Okafor, watching from the doorway with her hand never far from a sidearm she privately hoped she wouldn't need, began to quietly wonder whether they had found a survivor at all, or simply an animal too traumatized to ever be anything more. It was Elena, on the second day, who noticed the collar wasn't just ornamental. She had spent 4 years learning to find signal buried in noise, and the faint, irregular pulse coming from the device at the creature's throat was unmistakably electronic once she thought to look for it rather than at the creature itself. She spent 6 hours coaxing a trickle of power into it from a spare cell, working with the patience of someone used to listening for hours at a time for something that might never come, and when the collar finally flickered to life with a soft chime, the creature's whole body went rigid with what Voss would later swear, without any real evidence, was recognition. "It's not just decoration," she said. "It's a translator. It's been dead this whole time, not broken. Whatever powered it originally, it ran out before we got here." That single practical discovery did more in an hour than 3 days of gestures and recordings had managed, and by the second evening the creature had, for the first time, approached them rather than retreating from them, close enough that Voss could finally get a clear reading on the collar's slow, halting first attempts at translation. They never learned its name in any form a human throat could reproduce, so they called it Whisper, for the faint clicking vibration it made when it was calm. Whisper had no shared language with them, but it had something almost as useful. A portable device worn at its throat like a collar, that had clearly once translated between species, and which still worked well enough once its power cell was coaxed back to life, to turn its clicks into fragmented, halting text on Voss's tablet. The first message it produced 3 days in was not a greeting. It was, "They are still listening. Do not answer the ring. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." It took another 2 days of patient, exhausting work to get more than fragments, and what they assembled painted a picture none of them wanted to be true. The ring was not a beacon. It was, in Whisper's translated words, a culling, a structure built by something Whisper's people had never seen directly and had no name for beyond a phrase the translator rendered imperfectly as the Quiet Makers. According to Whisper, it had been active for longer than any species alive remembered, silently monitoring every world within its reach for a specific threshold. The moment a civilization's technology, its energy output, its expansion into space, crossed a line that made it a competitor rather than a curiosity. When that threshold was crossed, the culling did not declare war. It did not negotiate. It simply broadcast once on every frequency the target species used to talk to itself and to the stars, and everything that had ever heard that broadcast and answered it. Every powered system tuned to receive it, every mind connected to a network that carried it. Stopped. Not destroyed. Stopped. Whatever animated a mind or a machine, the culling silenced it in an instant galaxy-wide, for every civilization it had already marked as ready. That's not a weapon, Okafor said, when Voss finally pieced together enough of the translation to explain it. That's an extinction event with a trigger. It's worse than that, Elena said slowly, working through the timeline in her head. The silence we picked up in the Atacama array, every signal in the galaxy going quiet at once, that wasn't the culling activating. That was every civilization that had already crossed the threshold getting hit simultaneously. Whispers people. Dozens of others. All of them, overnight, gone. So why is Whisper still alive? Voss asked. The answer, when it came, took the better part of an hour to extract because it was clearly not a comfortable thing for Whisper to admit. Whisper's people had known the culling was coming. Not the day, not the hour, but the pattern, because Whisper had spent a career, before all this, quietly monitoring the ring the same way Elena had monitored the sky, and had recognized the signs of an imminent trigger days before it happened. Whisper had been aboard this ship, alone, running final diagnostics on a personal listening rig when the culling fired, and by pure chance had been disconnected from every powered system at the exact moment it happened. A maintenance panel open. A power cable pulled for a repair. An accident of timing that had spared one life out of, by Whisper's estimate, trillions. He's not a survivor, Voss said quietly once he understood. He's a witness. He watched his entire species end in real time, and he can't explain why he's the one still breathing. Elena looked at the readout on Voss's tablet, at the last fragment of translated text Whisper had offered, unprompted, after a long silence. Your world is not silent yet. That means it has not been heard yet. Do not let it be heard. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The problem, which none of them said aloud until they were most of a day into the return flight, was that Earth had already been heard. Elena was the one who finally forced the conversation. Sitting in the cramped galley with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, watching Voss and Okafor avoid looking at each other. We came from a planet that's been transmitting radio and television into space for over a century, she said. Not on purpose, not as a message, just leakage, background noise from broadcasting to ourselves. It's been spreading outward this whole time, in every direction, for 100 light years and counting. If the culling monitors for a threshold, it isn't watching for a knock on the door. It's watching an entire planet's worth of noise get louder every year, and we've been getting louder for a century. You're saying we already crossed the line, Okafor said, before we even knew there was one. I'm saying I don't know, Elena admitted. Whisper's people had space travel across their own system, off-world colonies, energy output that dwarfs ours. We're not there. Maybe we're still under whatever threshold the culling is watching for. Maybe the fact that we just built our first working faster-than-light ship 6 weeks ago, in a hangar on a shoestring budget, means we're nowhere close. Or maybe, Voss said quietly, the 6 weeks it took us to get out here is exactly the kind of leap that gets noticed. A species that goes from radio silence to a crewed ship at the edge of known space, inside a single human lifetime. That's not a slow climb. That's the kind of curve the thing you're describing would be built to watch for. Nobody had an answer to that, and the silence in the galley stretched long enough that Whisper, curled in the corner where it had taken to resting near the warmth of the ship systems, made a soft series of clicks that the translator rendered, eventually, as a single line. You cannot unknow what you have heard. The question is what you do with the time before it notices. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They arrived back in Earth orbit 9 days after they'd left, and the debate that had simmered quietly for the whole return flight erupted the moment Companion touched down and Reyes met them on the tarmac with a face that already knew, somehow, that the news wasn't good. He listened to the full report in a windowless room with 6 other people who had spent careers preparing for contact scenarios that all assumed a slower, gentler introduction to the wider galaxy. A first handshake, not a countdown clock. When Voss finished explaining the culling, the threshold, the possibility that Earth's own broadcast history might already have doomed it, the room did what rooms full of frightened, competent people tend to do. It split into factions before anyone had finished processing the information. One faction, led loudly by a member of the Joint Chiefs Reyes had never much liked, argued for an immediate, total blackout. Every transmitter on Earth silenced, every satellite dark, every scrap of outward-facing technology shut down in the hope that stopping now would somehow unring a bell that, by Elena's own numbers, had been ringing for 100 years. "That's not caution," Elena said, when it was her turn to speak, and she said it more sharply than she'd intended. "That's superstition. If our signal has already reached wherever this thing is watching from, turning off the lights today doesn't erase it. All it does is blind us. We'd be silencing the only tool we have left to see this coming." The second faction, quieter and smaller, argued the opposite. "Accelerate everything, build the largest, fastest fleet humanity could manage, and meet whatever was coming with enough force to make it reconsider." Okafor, who understood better than anyone in that room exactly how far human technology was from being a credible threat to something capable of silencing a galaxy overnight, shut that idea down within 30 seconds, not unkindly but completely. It was Whisper, translated haltingly through Voss and a tablet propped on the conference table, who offered the only idea that didn't rely on hiding or fighting. "The culling watches for a threshold of power. It does not watch for intent. My people never tried to speak to it. We only grew louder. No one has ever answered it and asked it to wait." The room went very quiet. "You're suggesting we talk to it," Reyes said. "You have something none of the species it has already silenced had." Whisper's translated text read, "You found me. You kept me alive when it would have been easier not to. That is a kind of evidence. It may not matter to a machine that only counts energy output, but if there is any mind behind it, any choice left in how it decides, that is the only argument I know how to make for you." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. What followed was the strangest 6 weeks of Marcus Reyes's career, and he had, by that point, spent nearly 2 decades doing a job most people thought was make-believe. It did not go smoothly. 3 days into the effort, a mid-level analyst on the Blackout faction leaked a partial transcript of Whisper's testimony to a journalist who understood exactly enough of it to be terrifying and not nearly enough of it to be accurate, and for 48 hours the plan nearly died in public before it had properly started, buried under headlines that used the word extinction more often than Reyes could stomach. He spent those 2 days doing the least scientific work of his career, sitting across from furious officials, patiently repeating the same argument over and over, until it stopped sounding like theater and started sounding like the only option anyone had actually offered that wasn't a guest dressed up as a strategy. Going dark would not undo 100 years of broadcast history. Building a fleet would not deter something that had ended civilizations with more ships than Earth would ever build in a century. The message was slow, uncertain, and unglamorous, and it was also the only plan on the table that did not require Earth to be lucky in a way it had never once been lucky before. By the end of the second week, the leak had become old news, crowded out by newer, louder fears, and the work went on mostly unwatched, which suited everyone doing it just fine. There was no vote, in the end, no single dramatic decision, just a slow, exhausting consensus built out of necessity, because the alternative options had all been ruled out for good reasons. Earth could not go dark without losing the only warning system it had. It could not outarm a threat that had ended civilizations more advanced than itself without a shot fired. What it could do, with Whisper's help and the recovered technology aboard the ships still drifting near the ring, Technology Companion had, on Okafor's judgment call, spent an extra 2 days quietly retrieving before the return flight, was build something no one on the Culling's list of silenced worlds had ever apparently thought to build. A message. Not a plea. Not a surrender. A record, painstakingly assembled by Elena, Voss, and a team that grew from 6 people to 60 almost overnight, of everything Earth was, transmitted not as noise but as structure, the way Whisper's people had once tried, too late, to speak to the thing that ended them. It carried Elena's 4 years of listening logs, the honest history of a species that had spent a century broadcasting itself into the dark by accident and had only just, in the space of 6 frantic weeks, learned to do it on purpose. It carried Whisper's testimony, translated into every major language on Earth and then retranslated by Whisper itself, into whatever crude approximation of the Quiet Maker's own signal structure could be reconstructed from the ring's endlessly repeating pulse. And it carried, at Voss's insistence, a request rather than a demonstration. Not a display of power, which Earth did not have, but an argument, laid out as plainly as 3 exhausted linguists and 1 grieving alien could make it, that a civilization capable of choosing to save a single stranger, at real cost to itself, with nothing to gain from it, was not the same kind of threat as one that only knew how to grow louder. They transmitted it from the Atacama array, the same dishes that had first caught the silence, aimed not outward at random but directly at the coordinates of the ring, 6 weeks and 2 days after Companion had first returned home. Then they waited, because there was nothing else left to do. The waiting was its own kind of work. Reyes had expected, in some part of himself he wasn't proud of, that the transmission would feel like an ending, the last necessary act in a crisis that had consumed 6 frantic weeks of his life. Instead it felt like the crisis had simply changed shape. Governments that had spent a month arguing over whether to speak now argued over what to do with the interval before any answer arrived, if an answer arrived at all. Some pushed to resume the blackout plan the moment the message was sent, on the theory that having spoken once was different from continuing to broadcast afterward. Reyes fought that fight too, more quietly this time, and won it mostly because Elena's numbers were hard to argue with. Silence now would not recall a signal already sent, and it would blind the one array capable of hearing a reply if one ever came. Voss spent the 9 days of waiting doing something he had not expected to find himself doing. Teaching. Whisper had, almost without anyone deciding it should happen, become something between a colleague and a dependent, and the two of them fell into a routine of slow, patient lessons in each other's grammar that had nothing to do with the crisis and everything to do with 2 minds that had decided, independently, that they preferred not to spend an uncertain wait in silence. Voss found it was easier, some nights, to focus on the shape of an alien verb tense than on the shape of what might or might not come back from the ring. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 9 days passed in a silence that felt, to Elena, exactly like the one that had started all this. Except this time she knew what she was listening for, and that made it worse, not better. She spent most of those 9 days back at the array at her old console, because Reyes had quietly arranged for her to be there when the answer came, if it came, and because there was nowhere else she wanted to be. Whisper stayed with her most nights, curled near the equipment racks the way it had curled near the ship systems, and on the 7th night it produced, unprompted, the longest message it had managed since they'd found it. I did not expect to see another world try this. I did not expect to want one to succeed. I have spent many days thinking this was foolish. I have spent more days hoping it was not. Elena didn't have an answer for that, so she just sat with it, the 2 of them keeping watch over an antenna pointed at a silence 40 light-years wide. On the 9th day, at 4:41 in the morning, every channel on her board lit up at once. It was not the Culling's pulse. It was something new, structured, deliberate, built in a rhythm that resolved, over the following hours of frantic analysis by a team that had by then stopped sleeping in any organized way, into the first true reply the ring had ever sent to anyone who had answered it and lived. It was not a greeting. It was not a promise. Translated as best as Whisper and Voss together could manage, working through the night with a patience that neither of them fully had left, it came down to a single, careful sentence, repeated 3 times as though to make sure it could not be misread. The threshold has not been crossed. The record has been noted. You are being watched, not counted. It was not a promise of safety. Reyes made sure everyone in that room understood that, once the initial relief had passed and the harder conversation could begin. It was not an alliance, not a welcome, not a guarantee that the ring would not fire tomorrow, or in a year, or in a century, once Earth's own growth eventually did cross whatever line had ended Whisper's people and hundreds of others before them. But it was time. Measured, uncertain, unearned in any way Earth could take credit for beyond the accident of finding one frightened survivor and choosing, at a cost, to help him, but time, which was more than the galaxy had offered anyone else who had ever heard that ring go quiet. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 6 months later, Elena stood at the edge of the Atacama Plateau at dusk, watching the first stars come out over an array that had been quietly, permanently expanded, its dishes now numbering in the hundreds, funded by a budget nobody in Congress argued about anymore. Whisper had elected to stay, for reasons Voss suspected were less about diplomacy than about the plain fact that Earth was, for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to think about, the only place left where Whisper's own species had any hope of being remembered by more than one grieving witness. It spent most of its days now working alongside a growing team of linguists trying to build, piece by piece, something no one had ever managed before. Not a message written for a machine that only counted power, but a real conversation with whatever mind, if any, still sat behind it. Earth had not gone dark, and it had not built an armada. It had done something slower and stranger, which Reyes privately suspected was the only reason any of them were still having this conversation at all. It had gotten louder in exactly one specific way, choosing, deliberately and in public, to keep listening for other survivors drifting the way Whisper once had, and to keep answering every time with help instead of silence. Nobody knew how long the watching would last, or what it would take, eventually, to be counted rather than merely watched. Elena thought about that most nights, standing at her console listening to a galaxy that had gone quiet once and could, for reasons still beyond human understanding, go quiet again. But for now the sky kept its old habit of talking to itself in static and pulsar ticks and the occasional far-off flicker of something that might, one day, resolve into a voice she recognized. For now, that was enough to build a future on. She reached over and turned the volume up, the way she had every night for 4 years before any of this began, and settled in to listen. Voss found her there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the particular tiredness of someone who had spent the day arguing grammar with a species that had never needed tenses for the future because, until recently, none of them had expected to need one. He handed her a cup without a word and sat down beside the console, watching the same static she was watching. Reyes wants to brief the UN again next week, he said eventually. Full disclosure this time. Whisper, the ring, the message, all of it. No more managed leaks. How do you feel about that? Terrified, he admitted. 6 months ago I would have told you the worst-case scenario was that nobody believed us. Now the worst-case scenario is that they do, and we spend the next decade arguing about what to do with a warning instead of using the time it bought us. Elena thought about that for a while, watching the readout tick over in its familiar, patient rhythm. Whisper said something to me the other night, that his people never got a warning at all. They were just gone, mid-sentence, without ever knowing exactly which sentence would be their last. We got something almost nobody else in that graveyard ever got. Not a promise. Just a little room to keep talking. You think that's enough? I think it's more than we had a year ago, she said. I think the only mistake we could make now is deciding it means we're safe, and going back to not listening. Below them, the array kept its watch. Hundreds of dishes turned toward a patch of sky that had once meant nothing in particular and now meant almost everything. Somewhere out past the edge of what any of them could see, a structure 40 kilometers wide continued its slow, patient study of a species that had, against every reasonable expectation, decided that the right response to being noticed by something vast and unknowable was not to hide and not to posture, but to keep the lights on and answer the door. It was not a victory. Nobody in that room, or in Reyes's office, or in the quiet corridors where Whisper now spent its days teaching a language it had never expected to need again, believed the danger was over. But for the first time since the night the sky had gone quiet, it did not feel like a countdown either. It felt cautiously like the start of a conversation, one Earth intended, this time, to be part of on purpose.